shapes are all subtypes of nodes. Now when you run the My JavaFX program right here, if we run this program, we can see a little bit of an interesting occurrence where both of the times the button is always at the center, even if you make the window take up the whole screen, or if it's even just a little bit of the screen. And this happens if you resize it. It's always centered, and it's always going to occupy the whole window. What if you wanted this to change? You can actually fix this problem by setting the position and size of properties of a button. However, it's a much better and a much more permanent solution to use container classes called panes for automatically laying out the nodes in a desired location and size. You place nodes inside a pane and then place the pane into a scene, just like you did with the button right here. A node refers to a visual component, such as a shape, an image view, or a UI control, or a pane. A shape is a text, line, circle, ellipse, rectangle, arc, polygon, polyline, and so on and so forth. A UI control refers to a label, a button, like we have right here, a checkbox, a radio button, a text field, or a text area. A scene can be displayed in a stage. And this means that the relationship among the stage, scene, node, control, and pane is a little bit complicated. So the way it works is that you have a stage. The stage is like the big granddaddy of everything here. You put scenes onto a stage. Each scene, just like on a theater, each scene is going to represent what you want to fill the window with for the most part. Then you have nodes. Each node is going to consist of something, whether that be a shape or anything like that. Those things that could become nodes are shapes, image views, controls, or panes. If you want to expand into those, we talked about shapes. Image views are for displaying an image. Control is for those UI controls. And a pane is something like a flow pane, grid pane, border pane, H-box, V-box, or stack pane. So let's try this out. Let's say we wanted to make sure that we actually have a smaller button that does not take up the entire screen and therefore seems a lot more like a button we know. So the way to do this is first, we're going to get rid of these, but we're going to create a new stack pane. Now I'm actually going to get rid of most of what we did before, but we'll add it back slowly. So the first thing we're going to need to do is create a stack pane. But before we create a stack pane, and we can either do this now or we can do it after we create it, but I'm going to preemptively get rid of the error, we have to import the appropriate JavaFX class. So we go to javafx.scene.layout.stack_pane, and you'll see that it's one of the ones that comes up. After you have this, you can start to create a stack pane object. And we'll call it pane, and that's going to be equal to a new stack pane. Now once again, we're not actually going to be giving an argument, we'll be adding stuff to this pane in the next line. So we're going to say pane.getChildren, and then that's a method call, .add, and then inside the add, we're going to add a new button, and that button is going to say, let's say we want this to now say stack pane. After that, we can now keep going like we did before, where except instead of adding, when we create our new scene, we'll call this scene, instead of calling that, instead of just adding in a button, we're going to add in the entire pane. So we're going to say new scene, and we're going to add in a pane first, the stack pane that we created up here, comma, and then we can give a size. Let's say 200 by 50. And then finally, we can set a title for the primary stage. And let's say we want the title to say stack pane demo. And then we need to set the scene by saying primary stage dot set scene, and then we're going to pass the scene that we want to set. In this case, we only have one scene to set, so we're going to say scene, and finally we have to display it by saying primary stage dot show. Now I'm going to run the program, and then we'll discuss how each of these components comes together. So, if we look at it right now, you'll notice we still have our old pane, and the reason I kept this is as a little bit of a contrast to our new pane. So if you look at our old pane, it still takes up the entire screen. The button will still stay in the center no matter where you move the, or how big you make the stage, and it'll always be in a very non-button format. Even though we call it a button, it doesn't really look like a button. On the other hand, when we used our stack pane, you see an interesting change. First of all, you'll notice that because we changed the size, and because we now know that the stack pane button is going to be more appropriately sized, we no longer have to make the window so large. In fact, it's a much more appropriate size, and it looks a lot more fitting. In addition, you'll notice that if we make the button, if we make it full screen, it doesn't take up the whole screen. I can move my mouse around, and it's not highlighted. However, if I move my mouse around the specific button itself, I can still click it without any ill effects. And the title still works the same way it did before. In addition, the button itself is still small enough that we can read it, and it's still perfectly oriented, so it's not like it's become narrow or any other issue like that. So let's figure out why. The reason this works is because when we create a new stack pane, a stack pane is like a little box. If you were to continue that theater analogy, it would be like saying you put the actors inside a car. That car can move around anywhere, and the actors will still stay in the car, and therefore the actors will move with the car. The actors don't change size, but they still can move, they'll still stay in the center of the stage usually, and the car can still move around, but the actors will still stay with the car. So in this analogy, the car would be the stack pane, and the actors would be the button. The way we created a stack pane object, that's nothing too complicated, but then we populated the stack pane with an item. That item was a node. The node was a button. Now you might be saying, well, isn't a get method, why do we have a get method to add something in? Shouldn't we have had a set method or something like that? The reason we have this is because when you say get children, this returns an instance of the JavaFX collections observable list. An observable list is much like an array list, but it's for storing a collection of elements. By saying add after that, we can add in a new button. So what this does, if you read it left to right, it enacts on the pane, stack pane object. It says get the children. This returns an observable list, so it'd be equivalent to returning an array list. Then immediately we just say add to that array list, because currently the observable list is empty, so we want to add an element to that. The element we're adding in this case is a button. The button says stack pane. And after that, it works the same way, except whenever we, in the last example, you'll notice, and we can see it right here, we always added in a button as the first node. In this case, we're actually adding in the pane as our node, because the pane is the more complex and the better way to do this, since by adding it in a pane, we're able to not have it take up the entire screen. Now that you've seen this, let's say you want to have a more complex example of a stack pane. Let's say we want to try and display a circle in a JavaFX window. We're actually going to add this as a third stage here. We're going to say stage, and we'll call this stage 2, is equal to a new stage. This will create a new window, and after that we can create a new stack pane object. However, you actually have a choice here. You can either add a stack pane or you can add a regular pane. In this case, I'm going to add a pane so we can see the difference between a stack pane, a normal, or a stack pane, a pane, and just a plain button. So we're going to first though create a new circle. Now this circle we're creating is not the same circle that we would have created in a custom class. This circle is a JavaFX object. It's already there for us. It's a visual representation of a circle. It's equal to a new circle, and we're not going to be passing any parameters. However, I'm sure you've noticed we have to actually import the circle class into this, because once again, if we're adding in a new class, all JavaFX classes are not by default imported for performance reasons, so we always, whenever we add a new class that's in the API, we always have to import it. So in this case, we're actually going to import the JavaFX.scene.shape.circle, In addition, for a little bit later on in this circle, we're going to be importing in the JavaFX .scene.paint.color, and I'm sure you can see what this is going to be for. And then we're going to add in the pane object, because the pane object class is different to the stack pane class. So we're going to import the JavaFX .scene.layout.pane. And with that, we've now imported everything we're going to need for the circle, and now we can actually start working and manipulating that circle. The first thing I'm going to need to do is, because it's a circle, we have to set its center. Now when you set the center, you actually have to choose its the X center and the Y center. Hopefully you know that if you were looking at your computer screen, you could imagine it as a two-dimensional plane. If you were working with a two-dimensional plane and you want to set the circle, you'd have to pick a point, an XY coordinate. So in that same way, with this circle, we have to set the center X and set the center Y. So let's do that. The way to do that is to say circle, since that's our object reference variable, dot set center, and then you'll see we have X and Y. We're going to first change the X to 100, and then we're going to say circle dot set center, and this time it's going to be for the Y, and we're also going to make this 100. You'll see why in a little bit. After that, we now have to set the radius, because just like with every circle, you have to specify its radial length. In our case, we're going to make it 50 pixels long. So we're going to say circle.setRadius, and then we're providing 50 as the value. Now hopefully you remember that every single time I provide a number in this example, when I say 100, when I say 50, I'm talking about pixels. So it'll be 50 pixels in radius. It'll be 100 pixels in diameter. So whenever I mention a number, it's usually going to be referring to the number of pixels that'll take up. Then we can set the stroke and we can set the fill color. This is because, once again, and this is why we imported these color classes, is because we don't want this to be a plain black-white circle. We want it to be we can change the color of the circle. So we're going to say circle.setStroke, and this set stroke will change the line around the circle's value. So we are going to say color dot, and then we provide our color. You'll notice we have tons of colors here. Initially we can say light pink. After that, we want to set the circle's fill color. So this is the outside line of the circle. We need to, if we want to fill the circle with a certain color, we have to specify that color as well. So we're going to say circle.setFill, and let's say we want that color to be color dot, and then we can pick another color. Let's say we want blue. And with that, we now have a circle that will be light pink on the outside and blue on the inside. Now you might be wondering about the difference in capitalization, why these changed so much. This is because the way that colors work in Java, if you ever have worked with HTML and CSS, it's based on CSS constants. So in that same way, when we say light pink, you're specifying a light pink color, and we're working with CSS color and CSS. Now we're going to be working with CSS terminology and the CSS naming convention, so it'll be color dot your color, and it'll be all caps. Now that we've finished all of our changing the values of the circle, we can now create that pane. So we're going to say pane, and we'll call this pane, is equal to new pane object, and we're not going to pass any parameters. Then, just like we did for the stack pane up here, we're going to say pane dot get children, and remember this is giving us a collections observable list. After we have that, we're going to say dot add, and then we're going to add the element e, which in this case is our circle. After that, we have to fix a small naming mistake. Sorry about that, repetitive naming. And then we can now start to create the scene. We have to create the scene and place this into the stage. So, just like we did for our prior scene creations, we're going to say scene, and we'll call this scene 2 is equal to new scene, and we'll pass the parameters of a pane, which is the pane 1 that we've created here that has the circle in it, and then we'll provide a width and height. We're going to provide 200 and 200. Now the reason I said 200 and 200 is the same reason I have x and y equal to 100. We want this circle to be in the center of the pane initially, but that can change, and you'll see this later on. So after that, we're going to display. We have to set the title of the primary stage, or in this case, not the primary stage. In this case, stage 2. So we're going to say stage 2 dot set title, and then we're going to give a title of, let's say, show circle. This has now set the stage title, and now we have to place the scene into the stage by saying stage 2 dot set scene, and then we'll provide the scene 2 that we created right here. And finally, we have to display this, so we're going to say stage 2 dot show. And now we can run our program, and we can see the 3 different types of layout modules kind of compared, the 3 very basic ones, admittedly. We will have a layout pane for the first one, and we already have an example of this. We close that, but we already have seen an example of this. Then we have our basic stage, which will be a large stage, but will be the button takes up the entire stage. And finally, we have our third stage, where we will have a circle that will take up a relatively small amount of space. So let's run this program. And now we can see the alternative between the 3 different types we have right here. In the center, we have the stack pane. The stack pane is usually going to be a very boxy type of design, and we have the button in the center, and when we resize the whole window, the button still stays in the center. Then, if we look at the second stage, which has the button new stage, the button takes up the entire stage, and when you resize it, it still takes up the entire stage, and it's relatively bland, actually. Then we have our show circle. The show circle does not have a button, but it does have a blue circle. This blue circle, right now it's in the center, and it's in a relatively small box. However, if we move the size of the pane, you'll notice the circle still stays where it is. And this is because of how a pane works. It's because of how we structured the circle as well. If you wanted the circle to stay in the center as the pane kept on increasing in size, then you would have to bind the properties, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson. But for now, you can see how big the difference is. With the show circle that we have right here, the circle is very, very stationary. The circle does not depend on the size of the window or anything like that, because even if we shrink the window so that the circle is actually barely even visible, or it's at least partly covered up, the circle still stays where it is. It still stays in that same location. Whereas, if we were to resize the stack pane stays in the center no matter what. Even if you change the size, the stack pane will always move with the center of the window. And then finally, the new stage button will always stay in the center no matter what happens, because it takes up the entire box. So therefore, you can't fit anything else in there, so it can't move by definition. So hopefully you found this lesson useful. In today's lesson, we talked about a lot of interesting ideas with regards to panes and nodes and UI controls and shapes. We talked about the 3 different types: panes, UI controls, shapes. They're all subtypes of nodes. We talked about how we can add something to a pane, and therefore it allows us a lot more functionality. We talked about how and why we have to import so many classes when we're working with JavaFX classes. We talked about the difference between a pane and a stack pane, and we talked about why, if you move the size of the stack pane window around, the circle still stays, the pane window around, the circle still stays in the same location. Hopefully you found this lesson useful, and hopefully you're able to leverage what we talked about with regards to JavaFX in your own programs.